Vice President Harris had a good night on the debate stage last Tuesday. She passed the most important test of all, which was to be seen as a credible candidate for President of the United States. She was generally comfortable in the format and, well, she also managed to get former President Trump off track on a number of occasions. Simply put, she got under his skin. She pushed him to focus on side issues rather than the more important things he wanted to talk about. Trump, however, did have his moments as well. Perhaps the most powerful was his response. It was a challenge to all of Harris's promises with a simple question. Why hadn't she done it in the past 3.5 years? Now, the former president would have done better if he had made that his response the whole theme of the evening. Supporters of the former president, of course, complained about ABC's bias. And yes, it's true the debate host predominantly focused on topics that were in the Harris comfort zone and put the former president on the spot. Topics like abortion and January 6th. Then it's also true that the moderators frequently jumped in and fact-checked Trump on the spot. They let Harris slide. And in at least one case, the moderators said that Trump's claim was false, when in fact it wasn't. But let's face it, the president and his team knew what to expect going in. Why didn't they have a strategy for dealing with it? Why didn't Trump have a couple of carefully prepared lines to highlight what was happening? And he could have done so in a way that enlightened the audience and embarrassed the host a little bit. Well, perhaps that's just not his style, and it did cost him. The bottom line is Harris won the debate itself. The bigger question, though, is whether it matters in the larger context of the campaign. You know, earlier in this year, I talked a lot about how debates hardly ever matter. They hardly ever decide a race. And then we had the Trump-Biden debate in June that was, well, quite the exception. Because of that, and because of the fact that Vice President Harris is so little known, it seemed plausible that this debate could also have had a significant impact. But after the fact, that doesn't seem to be the case. Harris may have passed the credibility test, but she didn't really pass the living room test. Her responses delighted her progressive base, but offered little to uncertain voters. Trump, on his side, may have been distracted by too many side issues. Often he seemed angry. His fans, I'm sure, were concerned at times by the way things were going, but it could have been much worse. And let's face it, hardly any undecided voters were watching. You know, here in Ohio, I was talking about an Ohio State-Michigan football game. Nobody goes to the game to decide which team they like. They go to cheer for that team. And that's the same with the debate audience this past week. Ultimately, the debate itself produced no game changers. Partisans on both sides will tout every poll that comes out as proof their team won a massive victory, but none of that is true. The race for the White House was a toss-up before the debate, and it's a toss-up today. Those are my thoughts.
Dead on. I think football explains life most of the time, and when you talked about Ohio, Michigan, that was correct.
Yeah, that is the sports bar theory of politics. You have two guys cheering for different teams go in to watch a game. Referee makes a call. One of them says it's brilliant, and the other guy says they must be paying him off. People see what they want to see. Trump fans saw that Trump had a good night. Some of them were concerned at different times, but they're convinced he came out on top. And Harris fans seeing the exact same things. The ABC moderators had their issues. But the Trump team knew that going in, like I said. Why didn't they have a response? Why weren't they better prepared to deal with that?
Scott forgot the cake. But Tuesday is Constitution Day.
I thought you were getting it.
Commemorating the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, which was written in 1787, and it has become the world's longest surviving written charter of government. Its first three words, we, the people, affirm that the government of the U.S. exists to serve us, its citizens. But then there was this recent article published in the New York Times. Scott saw this and said, hey, read this. It claims the founding document may be one of the biggest threats to democracy. The headline reads, the Constitution is sacred. Is it also dangerous? So what do Americans think, Scott?
Well, let's start with the basics. You know, we celebrate the 4th of July. That's when I do bring the cake. And that's, you know, the big celebration with fireworks. That's for the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Took 11 years before they realized they needed a little stronger centralized government, the Constitution. And it took another couple of years after that. before we added the Bill of Rights. When we start talking about the Constitution, I think we got to be clear. Most people don't hang out and talk about this on a day-to-day basis, but 94% of voters support the ideals or they think the ideals are worth fighting for, that the Constitution was designed to protect. Those noble ideals we talk a lot about, freedom, equality, and self-governance. Do want to point out, they're worth fighting for. We're talking about in political and rhetorical terms when we say this. So a lot of good support for the ideals.
But then you found this. So
38% believe it's a major source of the problems. Yeah, why should we listen to a bunch of guys who walked around in powdered wigs? I mean, that's kind of the attitude here. I think the other part of it, though, is people think my policies would get through if the Constitution wasn't in the way.
if it just understood.
That's really not the case. 59% say that if it was amended,
So change it.
which is part of the process, been done a couple dozen times. 59% say it should put more restrictions on the government, not fewer, which is kind of ironic. A lot of progressives say we want to put fewer restrictions. That's why it's a problem.
Right, and that was the thesis of this article, was that, if you took out all the issues that come with this, then we can really get about our lives.
Right.
But this says make it more difficult for government to do the things that it's doing right now.
Right. Only 20% take the opposite view. So by a 3-to-1 margin, hey, if we're going to change this Constitution, let's further restrict the federal government.
All right, and then among those who think that the Constitution is a source of problems, they say?
Just under half say if we followed it more closely, well, it'd be easier to solve the problems facing us. Something like this reminds me of a lot of polling we do on different federal agencies. People think there's a system in place, and if it worked better, that'd be fine. So they hear about the Constitution. They don't like the way the Republicans and Democrats are abusing it. But if we'd follow the rules that we agree on, it'd be better.
Right. That's exactly what this number is saying, is that, this document's a problem. If you actually followed it, though, you're going to have your life made a little more easy.
Right.
So interesting.
It is interesting. But we took a look at the other group,
Okay.
Those who say it's not a problem, it's not a major source of our problems, and overwhelmingly 2 out of 3 of this group say, yeah, we should follow it more closely. Now, again, E.D., we got to talk about the fact most voters aren't thinking about this every day. They're not planning to bring that cake to a Constitution Day celebration. What most voters think of as the Constitution, most of the time, is actually the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments that came a couple of years after the Constitution was ratified. Top of the list, 87% of voters say freedom of speech is very important. And I would argue that, it is the indispensable right.
Right.
And by the way, the fact that you have the right to say something doesn't mean that everybody has to listen to you or like what you say or like the way you say it.
And then
Freedom of religion, very important, a big part of the founding of our nation. We've all heard the stories about people who left England because they didn't want to be forced to adopt the theology of the king.
Now, this number surprised me a bit because people have been complaining a lot about, this outlet or that outlet in terms of news, but they still say that's a very important right.
74% are saying freedom of the press is very important. I think a lot of people today wish that the press would use that freedom a little more responsibly, provide news rather than cheerleading for their team. And by the way, both sides do that. So the
Next
freedom
one.
is important.
Assembly.
Freedom of assembly, getting together. Again, talk about these protests. You have the right to get together and protest. You have the right to assemble. You have the right to make your voice heard.
But it's like that punch. Your right to punch somebody stops at the tip of their nose.
Right.
So you can assemble, but you can't stop other people. And then this one I thought was lower than I would have expected.
Yeah, well, that's because we know you, E.D. We know where you are on this. But 56%, a majority of voters say the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment, is a very important part of our constitutional rights. Another 20% or so say it's somewhat important. So despite all we hear in the media, despite all the coverage, that right to bear arms is still important. And again, let's remember, this is what most people think the Constitution is all about, which goes to what we talked about earlier. People want to place restrictions on government. We should have freedom of speech. We should be able to say what we think. And by the way, if we don't like what you say or what I say, you have the freedom to turn the show off. You have the freedom to do other things.
Right. It is time for our brand new segment called Rapid Fire. It's a quick look at news, life, and you. Now, you're watching the show, so I know you're smart, curious, informed, but you also have a life, like me. In my family, when we want to express affection, there's no better phrase than, I love you like I love football. Now, of course, I watched the debate. Scott's RMG polling showed that of the 61% of Americans who knew there was a debate, only 29% planned to watch. In the end, 65 million actually watched. The most watched debate was the 2016 Clinton versus Trump, when 84 million tuned in. Now compare that to the north of 110 million that watched last year's NFL championship and almost 30 million Americans who watched the Super Bowl defending Chiefs take on the Ravens in the 2024 kickoff game. Yes, Taylor Swift was there, and no, she is not bickering with Brittany Mahomes. You know, in politics, what's unusual to see are politicians admitting mistakes and then quickly changing course. That's what's happening in Oregon, where good intentions led to bad consequences. In 2020, 58% of Oregon voters passed a law making all drugs legal. All. Instead, officers gave the option of a $100 fine or enrolling in a drug treatment program. In 43 months, they handed out $900,000 in fines. Only 8% paid up. And only 85 people completed the drug program. The real tragedy that moved Oregon legislators to reverse policy starting this month is a 50% spike in overdose deaths, a shocking increase in homelessness, child welfare cases, violent crime, and property crime. 58% of voters report crime as being a very important issue in this year's presidential election. Oregon, by the way, is one of the largest marijuana-producing states, and pot remains legal. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz popularized using the term weird to describe Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Vice President Harris and Democratic leaders loved it and ran with the term.
Some of what he and his running mate are saying, well, it's just plain weird.
This weird obsession with crowd sizes.
He said a lot of things that are weird.
That stuff is weird. They come across weird, and then they start being weird. Yeah, they're weird.
When asked about what they think is weird or normal, Americans Scott surveyed had different views. At the top of the list for weird is putting tampons in boys' bathrooms, which Walz supported in Minnesota. 73% say weird, 19% normal. Walz supported a hotline in Minnesota for neighbors to report each other for social distancing violations. 68% say that's weird. 20% say normal. Finally, this week in 1969, the Canadian government declared French equal to English as the official language. Now, if you've got kids or you check any social media, you've realized that even if you thought you knew English, there are some new words out there. We present the first new English lesson. Today's word is poggers, and guess which sentence uses it correctly? A, I was planting my geraniums and noticed poggers in the garden. B, my favorite YouTuber released a poggers video today. Or C, poggers is a game playing pickleball on pogo sticks. Well, the answer is B, although it's a bit tricky. Poggers is meant to express excitement or surprise over something, and hopefully you were poggers about our new rapid fire segment. Let's bring Scott back in from Ohio. Scott?
I am poggers over this new segment. You did a great job. But what you also did in that last little bit is explain why it's so difficult to get public opinion, why it's so difficult to conduct a poll. Because frankly, if I used that word, about 900 of the 1,000 people we're interviewing would say, what is he talking about? So it's one of the great challenges in our line of work.
And something else in our discussion there, we talked about the weird word, and there's a lot of other interesting things that people think were weird that Scott uncovered during his polling. So always you can go to napolitannews.org and you can see all the information that we're using in our program and see even more detail. So you'll want to check that. The U.S. Constitution has 4,400 words. It is the oldest and shortest written constitution of any major government in the world. America today enjoys the benefits of this enduring document, but when it was birthed, there was drama. Scott, can you tell us about that?
Well, yes. Look, the people that came together to draft this document had fought a war together, but they weren't really happy with the way the government was working afterwards. So they assembled with lots of different views. Big states had one set of ideas, small states another. North and South were separated. One of the people who spoke, a very prominent role, was Alexander Hamilton, later, of course, the star of a Broadway show. But he spoke for 6 hours. They talk about that in the show. He spoke for 6 hours at the convention. What they don't tell you in the Hamilton show is that nobody liked anything he said and it was never brought up again. The reason is Hamilton really wanted a monarchy. So he wanted a government where you got elected president and you stayed in office until you died. Oh, and by the way, if you're a senator, you got elected and stayed in office until you died. And We don't have any need for voters to get involved in selecting governors for their states. The federal government should pick all the governors.
Well, some people thought that the Americans just weren't a bright enough group of people to do this well.
Right. And look, the whole idea of our country, the idea of being founded on self-governance, that governments get their authority from the consent of the governed, was brand new in history, and it was controversial. And so Hamilton was clearly a part of that group. But here's the thing. They didn't like his ideas, but he ended up staying and becoming one of the 3 authors of the Federalist Papers that helped ensure the passage of the compromise that finally came out as the Constitution. And
Compromise. That's that unique term. I don't hear that often.
That's right. And on top of that, he ended up as our first Secretary of the Treasury. These people, remember last week I talked about, that purity drive, the no true Scotsman fallacy? Mm-hmm. These people found areas to agree on. They knew the end result wasn't perfect, and they knew they didn't agree on every detail. But they agreed to find something that could work, and it's worked very, very well.
We are just about out of time. We bring you a lot of information each week, and then we make it available online at napolitannews.org. All the polling data discussed on today's show is going to be posted there. And here's the number not to forget this week. 59% think that if the Constitution were amended, it should place further restrictions on the federal government. That's it for this week on The Scott Rasmussen Show. Stay connected with us. For Scott Rasmussen and the team that puts this program together, I'm E.D. Hill. Have a great week, America.